It is my honor to welcome you to the inaugural Ellsberg Lecture by the 2022 Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Azmat Khan. This lecture is being hosted on the campus of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwotug community. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant, portions of land from 82 Native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. A few words about the Ellsberg Initiative. In 2019, the Robert S. Cox Special Collections and University Archives at UMass acquired the papers of Daniel Ellsberg, a treasure trove of materials, some 500 boxes. Many of you know that in 1971, Ellsberg, our nation's most famous whistleblower, faced a possible 115-year prison sentence for releasing to the press and the public a 7,000-page secret history of the Vietnam War that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, exposing decades of government lies and deceit. Tonight's event is the inaugural Ellsberg Lecture presented by the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. The mission of this initiative is to promote public awareness, scholarship, and activism on the overlapping causes that define Ellsberg's legacy: peace, anti-imperialism, democracy, truth-telling, nuclear disarmament, and social and environmental justice. As part of this mission, this year we are partnering with the UMass Amherst History Department as co-sponsor of the 2022-23 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. Offered every other year, each Feinberg series focuses on a big issue with deep historical roots and profound relevance to the present. This year's series, Confronting Empire, explores global histories of U.S. imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance. I encourage you to visit the Feinberg series website to learn more. There you can view recordings of past events and register for future events, including the next event on December 1st about the successes, failures, and legacies of the Vietnam-era anti-war movement, which will include Daniel Ellsberg as one of the panelists. If you are attending tonight by Zoom, you can find more information about these offerings in the chat box, along with information on how to turn on live closed captioning and how to listen to tonight's event in Spanish. If you are attending this event on Zoom as part of a class, please look at the chat box for a link to our sign-in sheet. And for students who are here in person, there is an attendance sheet at the door. Please sign that. I'd like to thank the more than 36 university and community partners who are co-sponsoring the Feinberg series and tonight's event. I also thank the large team of students, faculty, and staff whose collaborative efforts brought this series to fruition, and of course, Kenneth R. Feinberg and Associates, whose generosity made this series possible. Many thanks as well to supporters of the Ellsberg Initiative. We now have the great honor of hearing from Daniel Ellsberg himself.
I'm Dan Ellsberg, and I'm delighted to join you here from my home in California. In recent years, I've developed a strong tie to UMass. I'm very proud that my personal papers are housed in the Rob Cox Special Collections and University Archives at the Du Bois Library. I'm very grateful to the late Rob Cox, to Chancellor Subaswamy, to archivist Jeremy Smith, and to UMass economist Bob Poland for doing so much to build my relationship with UMass. UMass Archive has a well-deserved reputation for acquiring collections that deepen our understanding of movements for justice, peace, and democracy. I've also enjoyed the opportunity to meet several classes of UMass students who have done research on my papers. Talking with them via Zoom, I found them to be remarkably insightful and engaged. In fact, on a number of occasions, UMass students have asked me completely original questions that I've never been asked before. I can tell you after 50 years, that's unusual. I also welcome the efforts of UMass historian Chris Appy and others at UMass to create an Ellsberg Initiative for peace and democracy. Democracy at peril at home and abroad, as we've been seeing this fall, and civilization itself threatened by the prospects of environmental catastrophe and nuclear war, of which we are hearing more in the last 7 months than we have for many years before that. This endeavor could not be more important or more timely. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Azmat Khan deliver the first annual Ellsberg lecture. I could not be happier at the choice of lecturer for this first inaugural lecture in the Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy, because her subject, on which she has enlightened this country and the world more than anything I've seen in decades, about the effects of civilian damage and the civilian damage we inflict in the course of our supposedly surgical strikes abroad, is decades overdue, one could almost say generations, going back to my own involvement in the Vietnam War and what we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've waited for a long time for someone to do the investigation that she led people in doing, in finding out the truth behind Pentagon obscurity, concealment, and lies about the actual impact of our air operations and our drone operations on human beings in the Middle East. I've really been obsessed by that subject, as I say, most of my life, and underlay my own work on interventions and on nuclear war. So I'm so happy that Azmat Khan is able to talk now about the enlightenment she brought to this subject as no other person has done for a very long time.
Thank you, Dan Ellsberg. Just a few more words of introduction. Azmat Khan is an investigative journalist for the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. She has won many awards, most recently the Pulitzer Prize for a multi-part series in the Times called The Civilian Casualty Files, the culmination of more than 5 years of research, reporting, and legal battles with the Pentagon to secure secret documents. She is now finishing a book for Random House based on this work. After her presentation, I'll join her on stage for a Q&A, which will be guided by your questions. So as you listen, I invite you to use the Q&A form linked in the online chat and on your flyers on your chair to share your questions with me. So now, please join me in welcoming Azmat Khan.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. It means a lot to be delivering the inaugural Ellsberg lecture. Daniel Ellsberg is somebody who has inspired so many Americans, myself included, and the service that he did, the truths he illuminated, has been such a guiding light for so many, including myself. And so I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be speaking with all of you. I'm going to pull up I want to tell you a little bit about my own work. And, I think that what's really fundamental to understand is the way that America conducts wars today. And so, tonight's topic is the human toll of America's air wars. And it's called that because of the way that we now conduct war. So, following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw anti-war movements in the United States. We saw an American public that was wary of sending troops on the ground to other countries to pay incredible costs. And there was kind of a determination that was made that if the United States was going to fight these costly wars abroad, that we would try to minimize the harm to American lives. And the approach to do that was to primarily conduct our wars in support of partner forces on the ground and deploy as few as possible American troops on the ground and assist those partner forces through a campaign of airstrikes that can include B-52 bombers, Arsenal, the kind of aircraft that you're familiar with for decades, but it can also include drones, right? Oftentimes the term drones gets used as a substitute to talk about this, but it is an entire arsenal of different kinds of aircraft. And I think no war reflects that kind of shift better than what's known as Operation Inherent Resolve. And this was, it began in late 2014. This is the anti-ISIS air war in Iraq and Syria. So as we saw ISIS take broad swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, the United States was really pushed to have a response, and they began this campaign of airstrikes, putting together a coalition of different countries in which the United States was primarily carrying out these strikes. And you just saw some numbers flash across the screen, and I think they're a little helpful to kind of distill. As the United States launched this campaign of airstrikes, I was reading headlines that said things like, these airstrikes have killed 25,000 ISIS fighters. And at the same time, I had been tracking the casualties that the United States government was admitting. So at the same time that US officials were saying, we've killed 25,000 ISIS fighters, and newspapers were reprinting it, the US government was also saying, we've killed 25,000 ISIS fighters and we've only killed 21 civilians. And I remember looking at that front page story and thinking, this can't be right. How is this materializing in an American newspaper and in global newspapers? And I really wanted to understand what was going on. Now, if you look at the kinds of videos that the US-led coalition was putting out about this air war, they were trying extremely hard to fight the kind of propaganda that ISIS was putting out at this time. So they were trying to publicize these videos, showing how successful this campaign of airstrikes was. And so I just want to show you, one of these videos. This is, in part, you can see in this video how these statistics really came to be. You can see a coalition airstrike on an ISIS VB-IED facility. That means it's a car bomb facility. And if you look at satellite imagery, you can see what that area looked like before, during, and after, and you can see just how precisely they hit those structures, this car bomb facility that we've seen. And so we have a level of technology unlike any other, and that level of technology can in part explain these statistics that can seem hard to accept, right? A lot of these videos were being published. A lot of the public was really looking at this, and this is the view we were getting from the air. Because remember, on the ground, it's hard to hear voices in ISIS-led territory. There's a ban on the use of cell phones. And so what we were primarily getting were these kinds of videos. So I just want to step away from this view from the air that I've shown you, this sort of high-tech arsenal of aircraft, these high-flying drones, this precision weaponry, these claims of let's just go to Mosul and let's kind of get a sense of what it's like on the ground. So I want to take you to a neighborhood of Mosul called The Woods. It's on the banks of the Tigris River in northern Iraq, and The Woods is filled with, as you can probably tell from the name, a lot of greenery, a lot of chinar trees, pine trees. And I want to introduce you to a single family. This is a man named Bassem Razo. He was born in 1959. He was born and raised in Mosul. He traveled to the United States to study and attended engineering school in Michigan. He returned to Iraq, where he settled with his wife Mayada and his brother Mohammed, with his daughter Tuka living with him and his son Najib. And they lived in adjoining houses, and when ISIS took over, their lives radically changed, right? Mayada and Tuka, his wife and his daughter, were forced to wear clothes and face coverings that was nothing that they had ever seen in their religion. It was nothing that they had ever seen in their culture. They were not allowed to leave the house without a male guardian. Najib, his nephew, one day was actually arrested for having a Western haircut and a shirt with Western words on it. He was arrested, he was sentenced to 10 lashes, and he was whipped, and he had his head shaved. And it was a really difficult time for the family. They became insulated, they stopped going out so much, they stayed primarily at home, and they just tried to bide their time until liberation. So they would have barbecues together, they would have family dinners, but as time went on, it was increasingly depressing for the whole family. And Najib, in September of 2015, he was reaching a kind of breaking point. And this family was really wondering whether they would make it to liberation. Now, what I didn't tell you when I showed you that video of the bombing of a car bombing factory, what the US-led coalition said was a car bombing factory, was actually, this video, was actually the home of Bassem Razo and his brother. Bassem woke up in the middle of the night, and he could see the stars over Mosul. The roof to his bedroom was gone. He called out for Mayada, and she didn't answer. He called out for his other family members, and it was only later, at a hospital, that he found out that his wife, Mayada, his daughter, Tuka, his brother, Mohammed, and his nephew, Najib, had all been killed. Shortly afterwards, he learned that the US-led coalition uploaded a video of that bombing of their homes and called it a car bombing facility. This is what it looked like when I went with Bassem on his first time returning to the homes that they lived in. We could hear drones circling overhead. The war against ISIS was still continuing. There were airstrikes happening in West Mosul. We could hear them in East Mosul where we stood. And he spent some time digging through this rubble. He found recipes that his wife Mayada had used to make desserts. He found a pair of white heels that he said were Tuka's. And he later told me the story of how she wore them. It was her first time wearing makeup. It was for a relative's wedding. And how he could just picture her wearing them coming down the stairs of their house. And, he told me about each of his family members. This is Tuka. This is her pictured the night before the airstrike, holding a firework. And he told me about what their losses meant. He told me about how he tried to report this airstrike to the United States because he lived in Michigan, because he had a cousin who was faculty at Yale, a cousin-in-law. He had connections ordinary Iraqis wouldn't. And he went to great lengths to arrange a meeting at the US Embassy in Baghdad. And he prepared a dossier of what happened to him with the coordinates of this airstrike, with details about his family members, with images of each of them. And he brought them to a consular officer. And as she later told me, I believe you. I believe this happened. And he followed up, and he followed up, and he got no response. That was around the time that I met him. And I began to look at his case. I began to investigate what happened. We say that we assess, one of the claims the United States has made is that we assess every single allegation of a civilian casualty that's brought to us. We do a thorough review, and when mistakes are made, we admit it. This is what we've been told about this era of precision warfare. What happened if this man brought this evidence directly to U.S. officials? What happened? But more importantly, how often does what happened to the Razo family happen in America's air wars? And this became a quest that was incredibly important to me and has now been the basis of my work for 6 years. And I want to take you through some of this. You know, I worked with a sociologist originally, his name was Anand Gopal, to do a systematic sample on the ground, basically to try to go to the sites of airstrikes in towns that had been liberated from ISIS. So I started with a suburban municipality south of Mosul called Qayyara. It's where Iraq's first oil fields are located. The population is poor but industrious. And I just went door to door, figuring out where an airstrike had happened, where something else had maybe resulted in the bombing. You know, sometimes ISIS would bomb something that they thought was sacrilegious, like a wedding facility, like a wedding hall. Sometimes there would be locals who, after ISIS had been kicked out of the area, would torch the house of an ISIS judge or somebody who'd been involved in ISIS. And so I started distinguishing between like what was some other kind of impact area and what was an airstrike and who was killed. And I continued like this for nearly 2 years. Ultimately, I went to the sites of 103 airstrikes in these 3 sample areas. And I worked with that sociologist so that I could do a cluster-based sample. And I interviewed people, I sat with them, I documented their injuries. I got photos of those who were killed or injured. I got documentation that they had, if they had it, to show like the names of those. I took all of the accounts from their interviews and I tried to match it, or verify it actually, with what I could find in the public record or other places. I also tried to track where ISIS had been located, where they had operated from. Was there something nearby, near this house? We also, working with a photographer, we flew a drone over some of these areas to take rapid photos, and it would render this kind of 3D animation of what these bombing sites looked like so that readers, the audience, could see it for themselves and kind of understand what happened. So in this particular strike, there was a car bomb. The house on the left was a place where ISIS lived, and the one on the right was where a civilian family lived. And ISIS, before departing this area, told the other family, look, we've parked a car bomb here, you may want to leave. The family starts packing. The car bomb is hit in an airstrike, and it wound up impacting both homes, right? I also analyzed satellite imagery to try to verify what people were telling me. If they said something happened on a particular date, I would look at the before and after and satellite imagery to show, like, yes, this did occur on that date. I would dig through rubble for any evidence of civilian presence or otherwise. I would try to analyze munitions. I would also look for any content that may have been uploaded online. It would often disappear quickly because of violating a lot of rules of use for different platforms like Facebook. If there are dead bodies in these videos, they get taken down quickly. So I was trying to preserve as many of them in real time as I could and matching them to these incidents. So, you know, the video that you're looking at here, the screenshots from it, it was for an incident that the United States-led coalition had rejected as what it calls non-credible, on the basis that there was no evidence that civilians had been killed. And yet I very quickly found a video in which there were babies and children with their limbs torn off in a hospital that I was able to match back to the area where I did those interviews. And the names matched those who were depicted in that video. I took all of this data and I put together a database and tried to understand what are some trends that we're seeing about how these civilian casualties happen. We did a rigorous methodology and took it to others, including those who've previously investigated these airstrikes for the US-led coalition, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We took it to statisticians. And the goal was to understand how frequently do these occur. And so that first 2-year investigation was called the Uncounted. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what we found versus what the coalition said. So if you analyze every single one of those press releases, this is back in 2017 when I was doing this work, and you look at how many civilian deaths that they admit have happened and how many airstrikes they have conducted, 1 out of 157 airstrikes results in a civilian death, according to these claims that are made by the US military, that are made to the public. What we found on the ground was that 1 in 5 airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death. That's not twice as high or 3 times as high as 4 times as high. It's 31 times higher than what we've been told in this era of precision warfare. Now, why is it so much higher? That's a harder question to answer. What is going wrong? When we tried to analyze causes, it appeared that poor or outdated intelligence was the cause of about half of these casualties, the civilian casualty incidents. And by that I mean, like Bassem Razzo's home, which was used by civilians, but believed to be an ISIS, well actually when I found out later, they believed it actually to be an ISIS headquarters. They'd also made the mistake of uploading the video with the wrong target label. But that's an example of an intelligence failure. It can also be outdated intelligence where maybe ISIS had been in the area, but they had left, and now a civilian family was living there. But I was limited in what I could understand about the intelligence that they had, right? For a reason that we are all too familiar with, secrecy. So the US-led coalition could tell me, well, it's unlikely or likely that we conducted this based on the fact that the nearest airstrike we did was this many meters away on what we believed to be an ISIS headquarters. But that was it. Now, in the case of Bassem Razzo, I was able to get my hands on the document that they had initiated after it was first reported, and then a subsequent investigation when it was closed based on my reporting. And I was able to get it in about 4 months instead of, 4 years, probably longer than that, by making a kind of creative argument under the Freedom of Information Act that not just that this was a federal government activity that was of public interest and I wanted to report on it, but that somebody's life was at risk of imminent violence if they don't release these records. You yourselves have concluded now that this is a civilian casualty incident. They've admitted it. They admit 4 civilians have been killed. They've conducted this assessment. I'd like to have it because it would allow Bassem to clear his name. I can publish a story about it. But he's also afraid of retaliatory violence, right? He's now been accused of being ISIS. Vigilante groups often attack those who are believed to have been ISIS, and this video makes his home a target. He's at risk. And within 4 months, I got a single document. It may be hard to read here, but I'm just going to read you a sentence of it. FMV, a max slant of 700, with ADMs opening and closing the gate for arriving vehicles. FMV means full motion video. So the surveillance video taken beforehand showed a max slant of 700. A slant is what is used to tell you how many men, women, and children are believed to be at the target site. They believed 7 men, 0 women, and 0 children were at that target site. ADMs, opening and closing the gates. ADMs are adult males. Opening and closing the gates was later identified in this document as a ISIS tactic, technique, and procedure. I could go on describing details from this document and breaking down the acronyms, but I want to just distill some of the biggest points. There was about an hour and 45 minutes of footage taken in this incident prior to conducting the airstrike. An hour and 45 minutes of pre-strike surveillance, and that is far more than most strikes have. They monitored these homes in 15 to 30-minute windows. And in the document, they said that they saw no women or children, but they were also filming during the hottest days of summer, the hottest hours of summer. They said they saw no weapons, but ISIS does not obviously brandish weapons so as to go undetected. They said they saw no overtly nefarious activity. They said that they saw ISIS tactics like opening a gate. And they also said that they may have confused it for an ISIS target next door. When I provided the document to Bassem, he was beside himself. It dawned on him that the Razzo's family's fate was sealed by an hour and 45 minutes of completely unremarkable footage. It was up to them to prove to a drone flying above that they were innocent. They were guilty until they could prove themselves innocent. Now, I got my hands on that record. We published The Uncounted. We were able to illustrate in detail what happened to Bassem Razzo and his family. But how often does that happen? And why? What does the other intelligence look like if this is what's known as a deliberate airstrike, conducted over a significantly longer period of time, vetted more thoroughly? What does the other intelligence look like when there's less even to go on? Now, I had created a database of all of those press releases. They would be single sentences. Each of these press releases would have, anywhere from 20 to 120 either admissions or rejections, credible or non-credible, assessments of these casualty allegations. They would say things like, if there was an admission, on April 5th, 2017, near Mosul, Iraq, via a self-report, we identified it ourselves. During a strike on an ISIS firing position, it was assessed that one civilian was unintentionally killed when his vehicle entered the target area after the munition was released. That's what we get as a single sentence. And I built a database of all of these sentences, and I started submitting requests under the Freedom of Information Act, because each of these sentences is supposed to have its own assessment. It's supposed to have its own document, just like the one that we talked about. I applied for expedited processing. I was denied it. And so with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I sued the Pentagon for the first time in June of 2018. This is what that database looked like. There was more than 1,300 of these assessments that were the subject of that first lawsuit. I began getting these documents, and rather than just publishing them, I started to take them and try to match them to people on the ground. And I want to introduce you to some of those people. This is a young girl named Rahaf. I'll tell you about her in just a moment, but first I want to tell you about the document. The document I had described what they called an ISIS bed-down facility, a place where ISIS fighters slept. They monitored it. They had it on their target list. As that neighborhood, Al-Tanak, in West Mosul, was approaching liberation, they said now's the time. They did some pre-strike surveillance. They called it a soak of the area. And they noticed something they were not expecting to see in this ISIS bed-down location that they'd identified as exclusively used by ISIS. they saw 3 children on the roof. It was perceived to be strange, and they sent it back for analysis. It was analyzed, and it was returned, and they said, well, actually, we saw redacted coming from the target. And now it's no longer an ISIS bed-down facility. It's actually a weapons manufacturing facility, and that's a greater threat. People can manufacture weapons here that can kill far more civilians. So it would be proportional to kill 3 children to take out a weapons manufacturing facility. When I arrived at that site, I asked around, and everyone in this neighborhood could point me to the 12 members of a family that were killed in this incident. They could also point me to a house across the street that was used as an ISIS bed-down location. Their neighbors' house was also affected. There was a different little girl who's permanently paralyzed as a result of that airstrike. They recounted what happened, and they said there was one survivor from the family next door. Her name is Rahaf. I said, where is she? And they said she lives with her grandmother now, and her grandmother lives not too far from here. Would you like to meet her? And I said, yes. And one of their younger sons got in the car with us and he directed us to Rahaf's grandmother's house. And I interviewed her. I sat down with her, and she was so warm. And if you'd like to hear her in her own words, she was the subject of a January 18th of this year audio story I did with the Daily. And you can listen to her. And she told me about her daughter, who was her best friend, and how that night her daughter and her husband and their children and their extended family was supposed to come to her house that night for dinner. They died without eating dinner that night, she told me. She told me about how they found Rahaf. They thought they could hear a cat in the rubble, and it turned out to be her granddaughter. That Rahaf she now treats like her own daughter. And we talked. After far too long, I really couldn't bring myself, it took a while, to tell her, listen, I have this document. With your permission, I'd like to tell you about what it says, and I would like to get your reaction. And she said, yes, please. I told her that in that pre-strike surveillance, they saw 3 children, and her face changed. And she told me that the children would sometimes go up on the roof of their home to get warm. It was January, it was cold. I told her about how they thought it was an ISIS bed-down location, but later identified it as a weapons manufacturing facility. At that point, she'd already told me about the bread oven on the roof. And I wondered if that was the redacted coming from the target, whether it was a heat signature. I didn't know. And then she said, I wish it was a weapons manufacturing facility, because then their deaths would have been worth it. And she said the only thing that they did was that they killed the children. And this is just how at odds the document could be from the reality on the ground. That document admitted 1 civilian death. I think it was an injury, because they saw a child being taken out of the rubble and brought to a hospital. 12 people were killed in that incident. Rahaf lives with her grandmother now. And the US-led coalition, despite this reporting being made public, has not modified its own numbers about how many civilians were killed. This is a boy named Hassan. He was playing soccer outside of his house in East Mosul when an airstrike targeted Neil Prakash, a notorious Australian who'd come to Iraq to be a recruiter for ISIS. The document says that Neil Prakash was killed and that 4 civilians were also killed in the process, but they got their guy. A few months after that airstrike, Neil Prakash was found alive and well, trying to cross from Syria into Turkey. He's now in a Turkish prison. But Hassan, whom you see here, is permanently disabled. He has shrapnel in his spinal cord, and he can barely afford the wheelchair that his family has. It's battery operated, and it's expensive to maintain the batteries. They've never been made a payment offer from the US-led coalition. This is a family, and I remember when the Kabul strike happened, amidst the chaotic US withdrawal in Afghanistan, and the details of it emerged, all I could think was, I have seen a document that describes almost exactly the same thing. They're following 2 cars, they've been alerted to a car bomb. They hone in on these 2 cars that are moving together through Mosul. It approaches an intersection, and the chat log doesn't state what the video shows. It's left out that this intersection is just swarming with people. Ordinarily, the identification of people in that area would have aborted that call. The weapons are released. It hits both cars. A number of civilians are seen injured and killed, and yet there's no secondary explosion from that car bomb. It was a civilian vehicle. They tracked the wrong car. On the ground, I had people describe to me, the man pictured here he's not able to see from one eye. Others are missing body parts. One man remembers, like it's imprinted in his brain, he told me, the sight of a mother in one of the vehicles holding her toddler burned into the seat. This is a young man named Yunus. He was in a car, passing another car, when an airstrike happened. The document identifies that they were intending to get 1 car, but they wanted to save lower collateral, smaller weapons for use later on. So they used something that was disproportionately large. They also didn't time it correctly. They didn't have their aperture exposed enough to see that it was going to be, the car that they were targeting was going to be nearing another vehicle. And as a result, it had a wider radius because it wasn't a lower collateral weapon. Yunus was thrown from the vehicle, badly injured, and he watched his father burn to death. He watched his uncle, who was already dead. He tried to crawl to them, and an ISIS fighter came by and shot him in the back because he was trying to crawl back to his father. And when civilians return or individuals return to the site of a bombing, they're often perceived to be ISIS helping a target, and they will do what's known a secondary hit, a double tap, as it's often called in military lingo, and everyone knows it. And so this ISIS fighter did not want him returning to the car where his father was dying, and he was shot. This is a document, it's one of the very first documents I matched. I went in before the pandemic. It was January of 2020, and I went to an area that, according to the document, had been a chemical weapons manufacturing facility. There was a compound. The document described how intelligence had been prepared, how they mapped out this chemical weapons facility, and how it showed that there were some children nearby in the area. But those children were determined to be transients, not living there, just present during the day, out and about. And they described the intelligence to everyone, and everyone in the room agreed. And one person, not a military person, somebody not trained in military intelligence, but for some reason there was a representative from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. She was a representative to this coalition targeting ISIS, and she said, I don't think those children are transients, the ones that we see so close to this target area. I think they live there. I know a little bit about cultural context, I'm paraphrasing, but she said she knew how local Iraqis would act, and they would not, during a period of warfare, allow their children to play far from their homes. She believed that they likely lived there, and these 10 children that they spotted in this imagery would likely be killed. No one agreed. They still believed these children to be transients, passing during the day, and they authorized the strike at night. I arrived and very quickly learned that 21 members of a single family were killed. Pictured here are surviving brothers who lived nearby. He described hearing the airstrike that night, coming, not being allowed to go look for his family members, and returning the next morning to find their body parts in pieces. One father described how he could only recognize his daughter by the dress she was wearing. It was the purple dress he'd bought her a few days earlier. This is a young woman named Karima. She was in medical school when ISIS took over. She had to stop her studies. And her family just waited for liberation. And something that was quite common that I would see again and again is that families would gather in one house. And it would often be extended families, right? Because you have men and women, but you would stay huddled together in that house, trying to approach an area that was liberated. So you would move closer to an area that was closer to the front line, and you would wait it out in the house. And the documents would describe seeing no civilians. There were more than 30 civilians in this house that was targeted. Fuel cans that were nearby fell into the house when it was hit, and a fire erupted. The men were upstairs, the girls were in the basement. And Karima went up the stairs as everyone choked. There was no air to breathe. They could hear the men screaming above them. But the door was barricaded in, and there was the tiniest hole that she used to breathe. She watched as her relatives passed away. There was a little girl she tried to help. She called out from the hole. Somebody helped open it and get her out. And no one else survived. Later on, family members showed me the imprints of hands on the walls after the smoke had really permeated the area. And the U.S.-led coalition admitted 13 civilian deaths of this family when 33 of them were killed. I will say, like, Karima did go back to medical school, and she now is a doctor. But she lives with this knowledge and no admission. And so often, what the people that you're seeing here want is an admission of a casualty. They want an answer. This woman is so moving. Her name is Rozkaya. And the document describes essentially a man who was pushing a cart, who was struck by ejecta from the blast and did not get back up, and whose body was picked up. And they conclude he was a civilian while they were targeting an ISIS mortar position. And I go to this area, and people confirm that there had been an ISIS mortar position here. And I ask about a man with a card, and they tell me there was a woman who came by looking for her son. She was so tired. And it takes me, many hours, but I tracked down one of her other sons and one of her other relatives, and finally I make it to her house. And she tells me about how one day in March of 2017, her son Ali set out with his trusty red cart to go look for a wheat grinder. Because this area of Mosul was under siege. There was no food. The family had wheat, but nothing to help turn it into flour so they could eat. So he set out to pick up things that he could recycle and make money, and also to go look for a wheat grinder. And by afternoon, he hadn't returned. He didn't return that night. And she was in a panic. She went out. She went to all of the streets in the neighborhood, the places she knew. He walked this cart, and she asked for her son with the cart. She went to morgues. She went to hospitals. She did this for a month and 3 days, after which a man at the pharmacy who'd seen her repeatedly asked her, "Did you ever find your son with the cart?" She said, "No." And he said, "Go to this area in this one neighborhood." They found a cart. She went there, and she saw the remnants of a red cart, and she never found out what happened to her son's body until I described what the document said, which is that he was picked up with the ISIS bodies and taken away. He was buried. She had shown me pictures in the newspaper that she'd put out when she was trying to figure out what had happened to him. Have you seen him? She didn't know she never found his body. One of the things that is so important about this work for me is that it's a chance for Americans to hear from survivors, to understand their experiences. It's obviously also about understanding what U.S. intelligence shows us and when that can be wrong and why. But so often, it's the story of these people whose lives are often not looked at with empathy. That it's so much easier for many Americans to empathize with those who've experienced casualties in Ukraine than it is to understand the experience of an Iraqi or an Afghan or a Syrian. When the U.S. announces that it goes through these processes. But we've come to a point where if you look at the history of American warfare and when there are accountability efforts, and when those accountability efforts are their strongest, that they're often correlated with anti-war movements. And when you look at those and why they occur in the United States, those are often driven by Americans coming home in body bags. But we've reached a point of warfare in which we can limit the numbers of Americans killed in our wars by primarily conducting them by air. And that means that we can conduct wars that most of the American public is unaware are still happening. In 2019, we dropped more bombs in Afghanistan than any previous year of that war. And yet that year, it received the least media coverage than it had on television news in the entire history of that war. The American public knows little about the wars happening in their names. And I just want to show you, those thousands of pages of records. I was matching them to people on the ground, but I just want to tell you some of the trends that I found when we looked at these records. There was not one of these more than 5,600 pages of documents, these 1,300 incidents they looked at, there was not a single finding of wrongdoing or disciplinary action. There was only one possible violation of the rules of engagement. Everything is about process, so if you follow the process, it's not a violation. over and over again, there was examples of confirmation bias, where ordinary actions due to existing biases were perceived as threats, whether that was opening a gate. It could also then allow somebody who was a USAID representative who didn't have some of those same biases, who didn't look at targets all day, to say, I think these children might live here, and everyone else in the room did not see that those are civilians, right? To see a car traveling through the streets of Mosul as a car bomb when it was not. In these documents, which are supposed to be used, we are told that they are used to not just admit the mistakes we've made and to assess them, but to identify lessons learned and to make recommendations. Even identifying root causes is rare. Lessons learned were scant in these documents. And there was almost no ground investigation or survivor interviews. In only one case did they visit the site on the ground to investigate. It was a very high-profile incident called in Mosul Jadida that killed what the US-led coalition admitted was more than around 101 civilians, but many on the ground say the number is even larger. And only in one other did they interview eyewitnesses in these documents. And in that case, those eyewitnesses were only interviewed because they were trying to collect intelligence from a group of people who'd fled a migrant camp. Who'd fled to a migrant camp. They were trying to understand where ISIS had operated in an area, and it came up that a civilian casualty had happened, and so then they asked them about that, and those interviews triggered an assessment, and I got those records. But in those two cases, only those two cases, did they either go on the ground or interview survivors. It means that Americans don't truly know how our wars are going. And it's not the kind of overt lie where records are being concealed about how many civilians we're killing. It's something that's so much more clever in some ways, right? They're making little effort to understand what is going wrong and why. Some of those I spoke to who were in the military said that, partly this is psychological. It's about feeling like we went through the process, like the reason why we do this, why we do these assessments is so that we can feel moral confidence in what we're doing, because otherwise it can just be too demoralizing, that these assessments exist for that purpose. Someone else who'd been quite senior and investigating at various points in time told me they're actually used for legal protection, to say we followed these processes, to insulate those involved from accusations of war crimes, but that they're also used to expand the authority to do particular things, to use particular kinds of bombs in these densely packed urban centers by describing a great number of these efforts that they take. And these documents never would have been made public, right? We fought over years to get them. And even then, they're only a part of the story. It's the ground investigation that really matters. And this matters on so many, it matters on a moral level, and it matters on a strategic military level of objectives, right? I can tell you with confidence from the areas that I have been to on the ground in Afghanistan, including after the Taliban took over, I was finally able to sample parts of Kandahar that I never could have gone to previously because I would have been afraid of dying in an airstrike. That's how intense the scale and pace of bombing was. Where on average in this one village, in an area known as Bande Timor in Kandahar, each family on average had lost 5 civilian family members during the war. And it was everyone could tell me about the first night raid in 2002 that killed a large number of civilians in that area. That was a turning point for many of those there, that turned this village and surrounding villages, due to subsequent night raids that killed civilians, to support the Taliban. But you wouldn't know it from United Nations statistics. You wouldn't know it from America's admissions about casualties in Afghanistan. The numbers are far smaller. They weren't going to these places. They weren't interviewing these people. Everyone I spoke to said they'd never talked to a journalist, and for good reason. You probably would have died trying to access these areas, right? But these civilian casualties were a major part of how the United States lost Afghanistan. But it doesn't just matter on the strategic level, it matters on that moral level, and it matters for an informed democracy, right? If we are to have a debate about our wars and to have the consent of the American public, they need to be informed about those wars. But air war, in which we create that distance, not just from those whom we are targeting, but that distance in terms of our understandings, our reckonings, our ability to even keep it in the public consciousness, all of that becomes more removed. It's part of that human toll of our wars. It extends into our democracy and into our understandings of what happens in these wars. So I'd encourage you, if you have time later, to read the parts of the civilian casualty files. But I'd also just like to say thank you all for coming out tonight. It's so heartening to see so many of you here, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was amazing.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's really, like I said, it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I was personally, and I'm sure others share my view, so impressed by the staggering level of research and detail and documentation that went into your work, joined with real attention to the human consequences of those policies and details. So, I mean, I think it's a great model to not just journalists, but to the historians in the audience. That we learn a lot from your methods and your persistence and bravery.
That's very kind. Yeah. I was very lucky to, I will say something that's important to know is that I can't even recall a single instance right now in which somebody wouldn't talk to me. There were sometimes occasions where somebody maybe wasn't comfortable talking and I would talk to someone else in their family, but people were so willing to open up their hearts and to tell these stories that are really traumatic, and so much of this work is based on them doing that work, and I think it's important to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without their kindness and generosity.
Well, we've got a bunch of questions coming in, and if you still have new ones, please feel free to write. They'll pop up on the screen. I'm not going to take audience questions right yet, but there seemed to be quite a lot of interest in the military's ability to create their own narratives of these events. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the military's own production of news and propaganda, and also about the use of air power, but also to what degree do you think the civilian media has accepted the military's narratives in an uncritical way?
That's a great question, and I will say that if you go back in time to when ISIS first took over a lot of these areas, we saw ISIS creating some it's often called the slick content. They were creating videos, they were putting out propaganda, and I think there was a lot of desire to outperform that on the internet, right? To put out a different view. And so, part of this was ramped up, like the kind of publication of so many videos was in part trying to respond to that, right? But in other places, so I'm talking about Iraq and Syria in this example with ISIS, but in other places like Afghanistan, it's not like the Taliban had some sophisticated media presence. And similarly, the United States was putting out a lot of these statistics and factoids that were not true. And in part, we can talk about how the media may have embraced that, but there's also taking advantage of a challenge, that the military is taking advantage of a challenge to get to these places on the ground. Like, as I said, with Afghanistan, there were places I could not go to unless you know, I had a death wish for myself, right? Like going to some of these places would mean, you know, becoming a target yourself unintentionally, right? It could result in your own death. And so I think it was hard for reporters to get access to areas, especially those that were controlled by ISIS. And so that was part of it. But yes, I think that there has been for a long time, especially when a group like ISIS exists that is so barbaric, that I think it's hard to take that step back and understand when what we're saying might not be true, and to take that kind of critical lens. I will say that there are organizations like Air Wars and Bellingcat that used open source information, that looked at the videos and images that would sometimes get out of these areas to verify them, to geolocate them to a place. And they were, during this time period, trying to put out their own estimates of how many civilians were. They weren't on the ground, but they were verifying that online content. But I will say that a lot of American media fell short, that we're able to see right now, for example, the incredible lengths that American journalistic organizations can go to investigate civilian deaths, because we're doing so with incredible effort in Ukraine, right? So it's something that's possible. And I hope something that this reporting is done, and that of my colleagues, because there's many others at the Times who've also been reporting on this more recently, I hope it will encourage more news organizations to make this a priority. But one thing I will say is that this is not new, that technology is used to claim hyper-precision, and then it turns out that's not the case. Like, this has happened repeatedly. You know, propaganda has never not been a part of wars, and I think it's something that journalists need to, you know, journalists who do incredible work, and I have so much respect for my peers, but I think that news organizations themselves need to make this more of a priority, and hopefully they will.
Well, I take from your work that the military, more than perhaps ever before, is simply stonewalling, evading, denying, covering up. And even as they claim publicly that they have every interest in minimizing civilian casualties, because they understand not only is that the moral right thing to do, but that if they fail to do it, it creates blowback and more anti-American opposition. And yet they refuse to do even the most basic investigations. I mean, this, what you pointed out, only twice did they actually bother to interview witnesses and survivors, you know, and you've interviewed hundreds. So, I mean, we might just talk a little bit about why that is. Is it precisely because it's so easy for them to do now? I mean, I was reminded, looking at those pictures of Mosul, you know, it looked like Hamburg after, you know, after the Allied bombing strikes in World War II. And I was reminded of this line during the Vietnam War, during the Tet Offensive, when the U.S. had bombed a town called Binh Tre, almost 1,000 civilian deaths. And a journalist asked a major on the ground, like, what happened here? And he said, well, it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. So, you know, now the military is not even admitting that they're destroying towns. I mean, they're not acknowledging even that. So, I mean, I don't know if there's, you know, an answer to that or further explanation.
I think it's quite telling. So if you look at what Raqqa looks like today, it's a city in Syria. It was razed practically. And it did not look all that different from Aleppo, which was a city, so Raqqa was a city that the US-led coalition was bombing, and it did not look that different from Aleppo, a city that the Russians were bombing. And I think that's quite telling, is that you have all of these rules and procedures, and yet the outcome can be so similar. There was one US official, he told me, I used to say that this is the most precise air war in the history of warfare. And I don't say that anymore, because Raqqa looks just like Aleppo, and you can't really make that claim. It's what is the difference here? And I think he said the precision doesn't matter if you're having this kind of an effect, if cities are razed. And I think that, you know, densely packed urban areas are extremely, you know, they involve a lot of problems, but we don't talk about those, right? The military is not encouraging a conversation. Investigating these on the ground would further illuminate the presence of these wars. It would make it more part of the public's attention. But I think a phase that we're in right now is one in which these wars continue with little awareness from the American public, and they're less politically costly. They're less, they can continue without such explicit end dates, right? There are many scholars who've written about this, about how our war today is never ending. We used to have starts and stops, but so many of these can continue with seemingly little political cost, less monetary cost, less American human cost.
Congress
but
continuing to fund and
Exactly.
double down on it.
Yeah, and we've now shifted those costs to foreign populations, and these wars can continue with little awareness.
Well, let's take a question from the audience. Toby has a question. If we could get a microphone to Toby, if you just raise your hand.
Hi, I have a question from, I'm in this group called UMass Dissenters on campus. This is a group from the team, actually. UMass Dissenters is fighting UMass ties with war profiteers, and we have been organizing against UMass ties with Raytheon Technologies this semester, and it's great. UMass has this anti-imperialist lecture series, and we would love it if you were a little more anti-war and anti-imperialistic in evidence. So we were wondering, what do you recommend to how to use the media in this fight that we have in the UMass Dissenters? And if you have any advice on getting the media and broader public to learn about this.
Thanks for that question. So I should tell you, I'm a journalist, and that means I have all these rules on like expressing opinions and advocating for things or recommending things. And so I primarily talk about what I'm able to expose through my journalism and what that can tell us, what that can show us. But it's important to me, for example, so those 1,300 records that you saw, that I mentioned, like I've made all of them public so that human rights organizations can follow up on them. And so what I can tell you is actually, I can give you some advice on how some of the journalistic tactics and techniques that I use to uncover this stuff, because that can also be a part of your work, right? These are not exclusive to journalists to do, right? Anybody, you don't even have to be an American to file a request under the Freedom of Information Act. And you're bringing up Raytheon, like an organization, a company that is of concern to many. And like its contracts with the US government are important. The places in which it has reach are important. And so I would consider filing requests under the Freedom of Information Act related to maybe its contracts with the US government, its reach, the particular ways in which it's evaluated. Sometimes there are monitoring reports of, a contractor's work that are done for compliance purposes. Sometimes you can get your hands on those. I've also been really impressed by those who have traced weapons from the place where they're manufactured to where they wind up used. They can be used by not just our own government, obviously, right? But they can be used in places like in Yemen, right? By the Saudis or by the United Arab Emirates. And I would definitely encourage you to use some of those journalistic tactics to try to get your hands on information and to tell the world what that shows.
There's a related question, which again, you may not be entirely comfortable answering given your role as a journalist, but this is from Ida watching on Zoom. What is one thing we as students could do to stop these attacks on civilians?
I love that question though, because it's so much about action, right? And I think that even asking that is evidence of an interest and engagement on this issue. The way that I have looked at that question is looking at historically, when has there been, like I mentioned, when have there been efforts to change policies? And so how did we get from a period of firebombing, what we've seen in Dresden or Tokyo, how did we get from a time in which we would carpet bomb, for example, to a time period in which we're like explicitly counting, right? Where we're doing these kinds of counts of civilian casualties, because that's a dramatic difference, right? And so often that difference was driven by widespread anti-war movements, which, like I said, were often driven by the deaths of U.S. service members. So like picture it, when there was a draft, almost every household in the United States was affected by our wars, right? Every street, there's at least one home on every street that had a vested stake in that war, right? And then the draft was eliminated, and we saw, these numbers of deaths go down, right? They reached fewer people, and it became increasingly a certain, there are certain demographics that the U.S. military will recruit from, and you're getting a smaller and smaller pool of people that are serving when you don't have a draft. And so the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the aughts, that there were fewer households now that were feeling those direct costs, but it was still significant, right? And now you've gotten to a point of air war. And, one place where I think, I've seen much more interest in that reporting than in my reporting is that I see a lot of American interest in what is the psychological impact on drone operators and those who are involved with this warfare. I see a lot of interest in that aspect of things. I wish I had something more uplifting to tell you about accountability and what drives it. This journalism did prompt reform efforts from the Pentagon, but for example, when I had a meeting with some of the officials who passed, this new sort of civilian casualty action plan to understand, will you be investigating on the ground? Do you have plans to reopen these past cases? And the response was, this is very forward-looking. We don't really have plans to relitigate these old cases unless new evidence is presented. I asked about condolence payments. There was not a lot of interest. I wouldn't even, my point is to say that I don't even think I can point to the journalism necessarily as confidence in that widespread change that often comes from a very engaged and active American public. But I know that that has been the largest motivating factor when we've seen widespread change.
The Raytheon question suggested that there are vested interests that have, that groups that have a vested interest in prolonging these wars.
Yeah.
There's a question from a Smith student named Jade, who's interested to know whether or not there are other international actors, nation states, corporations, that have a similar tolerance for civilian casualties, and if so, how do you explain that?
Yes. In fact, there's many that have far more of a tolerance. Saudi Arabia is an example. The United Arab Emirates is an example. Turkey has recently been using many more drone strikes in parts of Iraq and other areas. Obviously, Russia, and not just its current war in Ukraine, but in its previous wars in parts of Syria. This is something that is now widely used and adopted by other countries, this tactic of we're going to reduce our own ground presence and we're going to shift more towards air power. We were talking about this earlier today. There's a question of even when the Russian military might withdraw from an area, whether that withdrawal is really ceding that territory so much as, well, we want to continue this war via air and we don't want our own troops to be in that firefight. So yes, this is actually a global problem. It's a shift that we're seeing, and it's always going to be partner forces, or it's going to be, ordinary civilians who are the human cost is shifted onto.
Great. Jess, I think Professor Diana Sierra Becerra has a question. Is that right, Diana?
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was so powerful, and I really want to thank you for centering the dignity of the survivors. My question is that often in the U.S. corporate media, the wars in the Middle East are framed as a debate that we need to improve the methods of US intervention rather than questioning the mission of US occupation and intervention. So how would you respond to people who would look at your data and say, well, then the solution is that the intervention needs to be more precise rather than taking an anti-imperialist stance?
That's a great question. So I think about this a lot in the context of it's not just a debate over how we conduct the wars, it's a debate about the purpose of those wars and whether or not, there's a lot of criticism about how the United States has used, a law passed after 9/11 to authorize military force in broad swaths of the world, what was originally narrowly supposed to be about those who conducted 9/11, but has now been used as an authority for these subsequent wars that are not explicitly about Al-Qaeda or the groups that we were immediately targeting back then. It's created a lot of mission creep in many parts of the world. And so there's some who argue that these other wars are not actually authorized. And, when I say debate, it's not just about how we do this, it's a debate about our wars. It's about informed consent. It's about an American public that needs to be aware that these are happening in the first place, which is such a hard, that in itself is like that awareness, that understanding, like that 2019 statistic that I can never stop thinking about that. Like we dropped more bombs in Afghanistan in 2019 than any previous year of that war, and yet that year it got the least media coverage is so telling to me. So it's first like making sure people even are aware that this is happening. Then it's a debate over, well, should we be doing this, right? But once you take the number one thing out of the picture that made Americans care about this, like when we feel the personal cost ourselves, right? When it reaches every home, when there's a draft, when there are people involved, when we have risk, right? When it's not so asymmetric. I think it's a lot harder to have that, but I do think, like, I do not dispute that, like, when I say debate, that it's not just about how we do these wars, but it's about whether those purposes for those wars are also something that we understand. Because it's also about, like, what is the effect it's having? Is it turning the civilian population? It's so many things. It's about morality, but I don't think that this is in our, I don't think it's something that many, and you can look at it at elections. Like I think about this a lot. Like, how often do the wars come up when we have presidential elections? Like, it isn't really an issue on the table anymore. I was pitching my civilian casualty reporting in 2016, an election year, and nobody was really interested back then. I didn't publish it until 2017. That wasn't intentional. I don't think that this is one of those igniting factors for most, unfortunately.
Well, speaking of politics, we have a question from Al about Biden. Is Al here? If not, I can just, okay.
Thank you. I read this article. It's from December 1 of 2021 by journalist Ryan Cooper. And the headline is, Biden nearly ended the drone war and nobody noticed. And it stuck with me because nobody else was touting this. And he was saying the administration should be promoting the fact that it's substantially cut back on the drone war. So the question is, do you agree that's happened? And if you do, why do you think there's this change of policy?
Yeah, so I remember when that came out, it was shortly after the latest sorties release had come, the sort of annual airstrikes we've dropped. It was like some quarterly release, I don't remember the details. And it's true, you saw a decline for a period of time in that period. And it's certainly the case that we've seen a dramatic decrease as we have ended the war in Afghanistan. So you're going to see we rarely conduct airstrikes there. There was the drone strike in Kabul. There was a targeting of a major leader in Kabul earlier this year. There have been a few incidents where we've carried out these targeted airstrikes. There's limited, now that territory has been retaken from ISIS, there's no remaining caliphate left. We're not conducting that widespread in the same numbers. So we've seen a dramatic lowering overall, but we're also seeing the pace in Somalia. There was just an airstrike that the U.S. admitted on Friday in Somalia, I think it was Friday. You're seeing corners in which we've turned our focus or our approach to. And so I do think the withdrawal from Afghanistan is a major factor in that, and it is, I think that was politically costly. It would have been less politically costly to have continued that war. I'm talking about for a politician, right? To have continued that war at the way that we were continuing it, than to end it. But, certainly this president has made some of these moves, but there's an overall infrastructure that's still intact. There was recently they recently released these new rules on the CIA's use of drone warfare, and one of this previous policy that was the case under the Obama administration, that they would annually release these figures about these known deaths and about these airstrikes. It was taken out during the Trump administration, and there was an attempt to put it back in the Biden administration. It didn't happen. Those were released a few months ago. So there's certainly, regardless of the president, I think that there's been some continuity between Obama, Trump, and even now Biden in this infrastructure that exists and this overall approach to not want to deploy many ground troops. Although I will say there was also something interesting, which was that there was a raid on an ISIS leader earlier this year. And that raid, it was a raid. We sent our own troops on the ground to do it, thereby incurring risk. No Americans wound up dying. There were civilian casualties, I think children in this house. But that was also it was a change in approach. It's rare to have us take that risk, and that was something I noticed that this president was doing. I'm really interested in that question of asymmetry, and when is that asymmetry not in the picture? When are we also taking risk to American lives? I think that's really fascinating when that choice is made too.
Well, we're really coming to the end, and I just wanted to say that you alluded to it during your talk, that in effect, there must be moments when you get really depressed and sort of feel that Americans really just don't give a damn. But I think your work has really given us hope that maybe more of us will start to care about it, and I hope you share some of that hope. So,
I do. I know that you're very present here as an example. I hope I wasn't too depressing. I'm sorry. So
I just want to conclude by hoping that you will register online for our next event on the Vietnam-era anti-war movement on December 1st, a discussion in which Daniel Ellsberg will be one of 3 panelists. Many thanks to all of you for coming, and please join me in giving one final thanks to Azmat Khan.
Thank you so much. Thank you.